So, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund has finally got a new CEO. His name is Nicolai Tangen, described by Financial Times as a hedgy with a higher purpose, and seemingly the perfect person for the job. But as we know, he didn't get that job without friction. We've had a tug of war for months, and it culminated in Tangen being forced to give up 10 billion kroner stake at Alco Capital Hedge Fund to raise potential conflicts of interest. So what went wrong? What weaknesses have been exposed? Who won and who lost? And what will happen now? In the next hour, we hope to take you behind the scenes of big politics and big business and give you some of these answers. But first, my name is Håkon Bored. I'm a vice chairman of the board at British-Norwegian Chamber of Commerce, and I would like to wish you all a warm welcome. Welcome to all of you in the room here. You're not many due to COVID-19 restrictions, but it's still good to see you. Also, this talk is being streamed, so welcome to everybody who's following this digitally, whether you are in Rome, Madrid, London, or indeed here in Oslo. And of course, a warm welcome to our guests. Let me introduce Fridtjof Jacobsen, former vocalist in the band Glucifer under the pseudonym Biff Malibu, with 9 albums under his belt. But he's here today because he's a political editor at the Norwegian financial daily Dagens Næringsliv. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Richard Milne, welcome. Financial Times bureau chief for the Nordics and the Baltics, and a children's football trainer. Let me start with you, Fridtjof. We've all read about Tangen for months now. You, actually both of you, have briefly seen him and spoken to him a few times. What is he like? What kind of man is this guy?
Well, I think I just gave him a brief sort of elbow pump at the press conference before the summer, where his original sort of contract with Norges Bank was presented. So personally, I can't say I really know the guy. His public persona, he seems to me he's energetic, he's eager, and he's not too shy of a conflict. So you can clearly see that this is a guy who has been doing some deals in his life, and he's used to a quite sort of rough and probably quite intense like business climate from his days in London and from building up this quite impressive hedge fund that he did in the city of London.
Well, he must be eager. He's giving away 10 billion kroner.
Yeah, you asked who won and who lost. I think politics won, of course, in this case, but I think the head of the central bank, Mr. Øystein Olsen, won too in the end. And Tangen won a very coveted job that he really wanted, but he lost some money on the way. But I think he can live with that. His sort of way of life, which is quite absurd, but he can still, eat the food he wants and do these electric bikes. He has enough to pay for that for quite some time, I guess.
So walk us through this quickly. He got a job. Everybody said he was the perfect man, and then you started working. Actually, before you started working, you actually wrote, "This is the chef and the art lover Norway needs right now." Then everything exploded. Why?
Well, I didn't write that because I started in Dagens Næringsliv in May, and then the thing was already on the way. He got the job, he was presented. I was in another job that time, but I got this as a sort of flash message on my phone. And I remember I sent a message to my editor-in-chief, Mr. Amund Juve, and I said, wow, hedge fund billionaire as the new CEO of NBIM. Will this work? And he said, well, we'll see. All reactions are quite positive right now, but it will be fun, he said, or something like that. We'll see what happens.
Well, it's been fun.
And then the praise was kind of, the first 2 weeks, he was very much praised, and I was like, nobody's really saying anything, but yeah, this is great. He's such a very, skilled guy. He had a very impressive CV. And then sort of thing was, okay. I said, okay, well, maybe like Norway is ready for a hedge fund billionaire as a head of the sovereign wealth fund. And then my former place of work, VG, published this thing about the famous seminar, at the Wharton College. And then things started to happen. And from there on, like briefly you had this, then you had all this, what about conflict of interest? I mean, how was the hiring process? Who was interviewed? Started digging into that. And
So
then came this...
This is the seminar where he hired Sting.
Yeah, I hired Sting, yeah.
And
Jamie Oliver.
the former CEO, Slyngstad, actually got flown back in his private jet.
Yeah.
And few ministers were there. Why is this problematic?
I think this is problematic. First of all, it was kind of problematic because some people were there in a, at least like semi-government capacity, like the head lawyer for the government, the regjeringsadvokat, as we call it. Of course, Mr. Slyngstad was there. This was before before Tangen was hired. And was he there on official duty, or was he there as a private person? Can he ever be a private person, in these kinds of things? And several notable people from Norwegian government and the head of society was there. And then some of them hadn't really sort of declared that they went there. Some of them had, taken the benefit of being flown out and in the chartered private jet. Hotels were paid, meals. They got this show by Sting, which is, of course, is very expensive. And then can you do that as a public servant, and were some of these people more inclined to sort of put in a good word for Mr. Tangen, or, be in the hiring process and stuff? This is a normal, I think, journalistic question that pops up when you uncover like a non-official gathering for a weekend with lots of, was a seminar and party and stuff like that, and questions start to pop up. And then when he was sort of, then things started popping up about his integrity and his independence. And then, of course, you had this parliamentary oversight committee, which is called the Representantskapet, that started saying, well, this is not so. How will he do with his, with all his shares or his ownership in this capital fund? He said he will sort of break all ties with it, but what is in that? And then, conflict of interest started popping up, and for me, the process sort of moved from being an administrative, financial, like semi-financial process into being politics, and then you had a political dimension. And from that day, when this sort of got political and the oversight committee was engaged, which is just all like retired politicians, this whole case moved from a sphere where you had sort of a set of internal and external ways of seeing things and legal and rules and stuff out into the political landscape, and then it just started accelerating. And you could see that Mr. Tangen was maybe legally, financially, and sort of qualified in this kind of no problems at all, and even all these legal arrangements for severing the ties between him and Eiko Capital and his big fortune was okay for a lot of people in that part of the world, but politically it was not acceptable. And then, as often happens, and a lot of you people in the room, at least one of you know that politics, when politics comes into cases like that, the political perspective tends to win, because politicians are very skilled in sort of power games and narratives and that things. And then at the end, also Tangen, I think, realized that and said, okay, I give up. I remove myself completely from this. I give it away, and then I can start the job. And he sort of went back on the original contract that he had. But
at least he got a beer. That's what he asked for.
He said, yeah. I don't know if he's really... No.
I heard VG were waiting outside on the first day, but he'd already left out the back door. So
maybe Biff Malibu should write a song about this, Fridtjof.
Yeah. Maybe I should, I don't know if it will be a big hit, but maybe a B-side, yeah.
Richard, you've written that this is the biggest crisis in the oil fund's 24-year-old history, and that all main protagonists have been harmed. Explain why.
Well, the biggest crisis, probably because it hasn't had that many crises either. But to step back, I think if you look at sovereign wealth funds, there aren't that many in democracies. So already Norway's is a sort of rarity. And then it's become so incredibly big, bigger than the politicians, the fund ever expected. And I think really what happened here was you had, I think it was last year, was it the Central Bank Act? And that went through sort of pretty much unquestioned, undiscussed. And actually there was quite a big point in that. Ingvar Slingstad, the former head of the fund, said it was the biggest question in 20 years for the fund, and that was whether the fund should be based in the central bank or whether it should be independent. And what you saw in this debate was that question, became really important. And how is the fund organised? Who oversees the fund? It suddenly came out in the middle of the debate that actually the finance minister could have had much more influence over the process than he'd imagined, than he'd conceded. And so I think, I'd possibly disagree with the characterisation of Øystein Olsen as a winner in the affair. From where it looks to me, his reputation was damaged. I think the handling of the affair didn't look.
But he got the CEO he wanted.
He got the CEO in the end, and that's the positive thing, I think. Yeah. So if it's on results, then it's that. But I think there are questions about, is Norges Bank? I think when it was announced, my reaction was very much the same as Norway ready for this, but also this is a really gutsy move by Norges Bank to appoint somebody like that, a rich hedge fund billionaire. And I'd imagined it would have been sort of, anchored politically a lot more than it turned out it was.
So can I stop you there? I'll bite a bit Fritjof, just a quick question. Why wasn't it anchored? I mean, what's Olsen thinking here?
What's he thinking? I don't know. No, that's a very central question. If you're gonna, could maybe say that if he anchored this better, it would maybe have been possible to get through with the original, agreement that he could actually keep parts of AKO Capital and under the sort of legal regime that they drew up and presented in was it May or something? Yeah, signed and everything. So maybe if it was more anchored politically, he could have done it. What I experienced working with this case is when it comes to a case where you sort of everyone sees that this has to end somewhere. Either he gets the job or he doesn't get the job. Either Øystein Olsen stays or he has to resign. It comes to those. There's a lot of drama, and of course then it gains a lot of interest because that this has to end somewhere. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose, and everything. And then usually when things come to this in the political sphere, there's a lot of spin and chat on the sort of back channels, where different parties will sort of chip in on different results or different people. You would hear, typically in a case like this, you would hear that, why are you hacking away at Mr. Tangen? Tangen is a great guy, he should get the job, and you will be subjected to a lot of sort of argumentation.
You as an editor?
As an editor or as a journalist or as a columnist or everything, but then not on the record, but off the record, you will be sort of subjected to that at all time. This happened, it happened in some cases where sort of politics and business meet around the Telenor, when there was this thing about Mrs. Berit Svendsen and Sigve Brekke. You see different sides are taking positions and trying to sort of define the narrative and doing arguments for either outcome. In Mr. Tangen's case, he had no real champions within the political sort of establishment. He had some kind of on the fringes. He had a lot of champions among financial business people, and of course his friends. He has a lot of friends with high positions in Norwegian society, but among the political parties, not a single party, as I experienced, was sort of chipping in for him in that thing. And then it's like, oh, here I thought, you probably don't have such a good case. And you could see that the finance committee in the parliament, in the Storting, was also unanimous, you know, when it came to their recommendation in the case. Also, this oversight committee has a very broad spectrum of politicians from the sort of far left to the far right. And they were also like unanimous, and they were headed by our Prime Minister's former chief of staff, you know, who is a conservative politician in herself. And she was kind of aggressive too. And not only in her writing, but she gave some interviews where she had this like political argumentation about how should I explain to the cashier, you know, in my grocery store that, you know, the same rules doesn't apply for a rich guy who's going to be, you know, CEO of NBIM. And another, you know, like public servant at a lower level who has such strict rules for what he or she can do or not. I mean, and then I was like, oh, he's going to have trouble. And then in the end, I think the case, sort of the story was, you have like politics and their logic versus sort of a business finance logic. And in the middle, you had the Treasury Department, Finance Department, that were trying to sort of saying, no, we really can't do anything with this, and probably said to Mr. Sanner, the finance minister, no, I mean, you can't do anything. I mean, it's illegal under this new Central Bank Act. And then he went to a law firm, not this law firm, but another law firm, and sort of got the stamp on that, saying, no, you can't do anything. And then came sort of the legal experts in the Justice Department and said, no, you can actually do something. And then when they said that, game over.
So lawyers were arguing.
Yeah, yeah. But it's an interesting detail that Mr. Sanner, from his own, you know, from the Treasury Department, which should be experts on this Central Bank Act, because, I mean, that's under their thing, are giving him a piece of advice or sort of defining his room of action as much narrower than it actually is. I mean, I think it should be interesting to know the conversations between the finance minister and his sort of higher public servants in this case, and said, why did you advise me? And said I couldn't do anything when I actually could, because maybe he could have solved the case much earlier. Yeah. And then second question, did this case or the story actually belong in politics? Because nobody said, this shouldn't be politics. This is very clean cut. It's the law, and it's like they're independent, and we should respect that. But I think the sovereign wealth fund is not like the central bank. The sovereign wealth fund can actually be emptied out and put down if the politicians want it. It's made by politicians. It's our common sort of fortune that is I mean, belongs to sort of everybody in Norway, and it's a political responsibility what we do with this money, and also a lot of the investment strategies and rules and what the wealth fund can do and cannot do is actually quite strictly regulated by the Treasury Department, which is a political body.
I'm going to stop you there because we're going to get back to this. Richard, you said that you said to me before this debate that this fund is more debated and there are more interest in the oil fund in the UK than in Norway.
Yeah.
Why is that?
In some aspects, I think. I mean, here it is the rainy day fund. It is makes an enormous amount of money. But what struck me here is actually politically before this, it was seen as a pretty uninteresting thing. I know very senior political advisor. I met with my son. He was ill. We were going to the oil fund press conference one day, and he asked, "Oh, are you going there as well?" And she said, "Oh no, I don't bother with the oil fund. That's too technical." And I thought that was quite striking. I mean, the oil fund owns, on average, 1.5% of every listed company in the world. So, for me, it's the biggest story in the Nordics. It touches on every single one of my readers everywhere in the world, and that's where our interest in it has been. And I think maybe if I had to see a sort of silver lining in this, I think what's been interesting is you're starting to see a much better debate and stronger interest in Norway, and let's see whether that carries on. But it has been really a thing for Dagens Nytings leave the financial paper and maybe the financial pages, and I think it's much more important than that.
So if we start that debate now, what do you think is the main challenge of the setup of the oil fund today? Has Tangen got the right people around him?
What do I say? Well, I think a few things. I think what Fridtjof was saying, I think what I was trying to say with it being a rare sovereign wealth fund in the democracy is the question is how far are politicians allowed to intervene, and how far is too far, in a sense. And I think, it's clear some politicians would like a lot more influence on the fund. They'd like to, it to invest in certain ways. And so that's always in the back of the mind. And I think, placing it in the central bank doesn't give it a complete firewall, but it gives it a lot of protection that it wouldn't have had. I think it's interesting talking to fund officials, for instance, they said, had the fund been independent, as most people in the fund wanted it to be, Nicolai Tangen wouldn't be chief executive today. He would have never got through. I think that could be true. I think the issue for me is how is the control of the fund? So Nicolai Tangen was chosen by the executive board of Norges Bank. If you look there, they're all Norwegians, and there's nobody who has had a lot of asset management perspective. That, from an international perspective, looks an odd control organ to have for an investor. Can they properly hold Tangen accountable? Can they understand what he's up to in the fund? Then you have...
So just so I understand you right, because the oil fund is investing abroad, you are saying it's a bit strange that there are only Norwegians controlling Tangen.
I think if this was certainly in the financial world, if this was a normal fund investor, it is an international investor, you'd want one person in there that had international experience, that it could be Norwegian, and I think you'd want, somebody there with asset management experience. I think, if you look at the financial crisis and banks, for instance, the big learning was you need to have people on board bank boards who understand banks. And so I think that at least would be the financial perspective. The political one may be something different.
Fridtjof, should we now, if this is right, should we now be worried that Tangen can run rings around his own board and do exactly what he wants with our money?
Of course, should worry about that, but I think under Mr. Slyngstad's, when he appeared as CEO, the oil fund was very skilled at sort of keeping out of sight and out of mind unless they wanted to be seen for something. And I think also, as you say, that the main board, as it's called, hovedstyret in the central bank, is only Norwegian, but it's also the main board for the central bank, so it's kind of hard to put other people with other nationalities in sort of the main board for our central bank too. That's a dilemma.
Well, that's my. Yeah. One of my points is they decided to have separate boards for monetary policy and for, let's say, asset management.
Yeah.
But I don't really understand why the main board doesn't do monetary policy, because that's the main task of a central bank.
That's true.
And therefore, then you could have an asset management board that, could have. But somebody like Hank Paulson of Goldman Sachs, could he sit on an asset management board? Yes. Can he sit in the main board of Norges Bank? Absolutely not.
So, but
the next commentary there.
Yeah, it should be. No, but I think, what seems to me like both the fund and the bank, for that instance, are very they're good not only in like having independence sort of in the book and in the laws, but also in their everyday life. And then I think for the oil fund to have very few political problems, except that they sometimes get instructed to go in and out of some companies or like investment classes, which they do, and then they have to please this section in the Treasury Department that sort of keeps oversight on them very, very closely. You know, you can only have this many stocks, and you can only have this many sort of state loan papers and real estate and things like that. They have been very good at sort of keeping off the political dimension, both in Norway and also in all the investment, because I mean it's with the massive ownership that they have. Right now they also in the real estate they own. We wrote about this in the paper today. They own the Savile Row, you know, where all the guys who makes the suits are. And of course, after COVID-19 and also like a general more casualization of the way of business, these or like all these vintage tailors are having a hard time. And then they say maybe they can't pay the rent, you know. So what are they going to do? Is like Norway going to kick out all these like old school tailors from Savile Row and then change the street? That could soon be a political question, you know. But they are good of steering out of this. And I think Mr. Tangen's first job is sort of, and you can see he's very sort of tight-lipped. He doesn't give many interviews these days. It's just like, get things to calm down so we can work in peace and don't have a high profile because you risk of saying something that will sort of fire this whole thing up again. And so go back to normal where we sort of hide inside the bank and do our business and people don't really bother us. And I think that's his main job, to sort of get into that, and then he can start developing the fund, I think.
I think maybe he learned quickly when the first sentence he said was that we should have 100% inheritance tax in Norway. He probably learned that everything he says is political.
Yeah.
We are going to open up for questions later. We're just going to have one more session and then we'll take some questions if you have any. 2 sentences at the end here now. So Tangen has started. He came to work on his electric scooter. So, you know, the battle for the narrative has started. And of course, then he crashed a few days later and broke his arm or whatever on the same scooter. So, but quickly, just 2 sentences each. What will be his greatest challenge? Maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, the ownership, being a responsible owner and making sure that Norway isn't seen as Norway acting, Norway imposing its standards on other countries, on property owners, you know.
Yeah, I think making sure that the fund can be an attractive place to work for the talent you need. Although they pay, I mean, fragments of what you can earn in the big sort of funds and banks on Wall Street and in the city of London. That is one thing, so build the organization, keep it modern and attract the talent. And number 2, continue to build, although he's a different personality, on this sort of very discreet and as you say, sort of no fuss, out of sight, out of mind policy that the fund had under Mr. Slyngstad. That's sort of because if you get a lot of scandals and stuff about the fund, the whole idea itself is sort of under threat, and then politicians who really wants to get a hold of this money to build all the roads or green or whatever they want to do with all this money, there are a lot of ideas that you can throw around for all these billions of kroner. If the fund is sort of seen as something that's not sort of Norwegian or solid or risky or something like that, it's much easier to break it up and take out the money, and then it's maybe good for us, maybe not, I don't know, but for future generations it would be a catastrophe.
So stakeholder management, that's what I'm hearing. Okay, thank you very much. We have one more speaker, and that's Berit Reiss-Andersen. If you could change mic with her somehow. So Berit is a former board member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, former deputy minister of Ministry of Justice, and today she's here as head of litigation, arbitration and investigation here at DLA Piper in Norway. So the Norwegian Oil Fund is the largest shareholder in the world, with shares in 9,000 companies in 70 markets. They're slowly changing their policies from very, very passive to a bit more active. Berit, I think, is going to walk us through why this can be challenging. And
not really.
Okay. And maybe explain to us why this will always be politicians' playground?
Definitely the latter. I have to first give a disclaimer. I absolutely have no expertise that is relevant to stand here and speak in front of you, except perhaps offering you some perspectives on a very interesting textbook case on how politics meets business and finance. And first of all, I would like to offer you a historical perspective, because in my opinion, the political influence has been extraordinary in Norway when it comes to exploration of oil. After World War II, we entered an era in Norwegian politics of a social democratic regime, a planned economy, a strong state involvement in the slogan, build the country. And build the country meant not rebuild the country of war damages, but make a new order with distribution of wealth, to avoid the pre-war polarized political fights between a working class and a privileged class. So, and this political hegemony lasted so long that it really created Norway. And then came the fantastic Christmas gift to Norway in 1966 with the opening of the Ekofisk. And it was actually 23rd of December, what we call Lille Julaften. And nobody realized what a fantastic Christmas gift they actually had been offered. And here we see, prior to that, of course, there had been a political battle of controlling the Norwegian continental shelf. This was the basis for the whole development. But then, when production started, Norway introduced a tax regime that was ridiculed, because the taxes are still extraordinarily high on the oil that is actually pumped up in Norway. I think it's presently at 78%. But the lenient tax system for the companies when they are doing their exploration or when they are not making money. And there's a lot of other mechanisms that I will not get into the details of now. And for the first years, the oil revenues just seeped into the state budget and did really, was a very important contribution to building the country. But in 1990, one realized these revenues are really growing over our heads. We have to do something with them. And then, of course, this was a parliamentary debate. We must not forget that this sector is regulated by law. And who creates laws? Politicians do. So it's intertwined like this. So the oil fund, as it was called, it's changed its name several times, was created in 1990. And since our state budget was at the time with deficits, the bank account of the oil fund was not opened until 1996. And a lot of legislation to support it. And the present state of affairs from the first deposit in 1996, we own the most valuable sovereign wealth fund. So this is the background, and both of the very interesting speakers touched upon the legal framework of how the fund is organized and managed. And let's have a look at that, because here we have the board of directors of the Norges Bank. And as both the former speakers mentioned, when we had the new bank law of 2019, it was a big discussion in Parliament, the independency of the oil fund. But it was a decision that the white paper for the bill suggested an independent structure. But the solution was to have it organized in Norges Bank, and you see that Norges Bank, or the fund to the far left, has a CEO who reports to the board of directors of Norges Bank, and of course they can instruct back. So apparently this is a very independent entity, but this is not a fact, because first of all, the principle is that it is the Ministry of Finance who actually deposits the profits of the state budget into the bank account. And it is the Ministry of Finance who gives the oil fund a mandate on how to manage the deposits. And these instructions, even though they have not been a particular bill in Parliament, they need political support. So the management has behind itself a political instruction, if you want to see it in that perspective. And then further down the road, because politicians realized, well, this is an awful lot of money, and we have become a very important player in the international finance markets, and profits are very good, but what kind of, do we want profits, at whatever price? Because in the legislation of the oil fund, the purpose of the fund is clearly defined to invest and proceed profits for the Norwegian people and for future expenses in Norway. So when these doubts came about how the Norwegian fund actually operates in international markets, the idea came to create the institution of ethical funds, an ethical board. And it's even more interesting that the instructions to the code of ethics for the ethical board is designed and drafted by the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance is politically instructed. And the criteria, the system of the ethical board or the ethical instructions is that there's investments that can be excluded, or investments can be set under observation. And what is excluded is subject to very fierce debate in Norway and great political interest, not only in Parliament, but certainly also by lots of organizations and NGOs who engage very strongly in these issues. But just to give you the very rough framework of the ethical codes, what are excluded are non-renewable raw materials, which is a bit ironic. And it has strong limitations on weapon industries, particularly the forbidden weapons as cluster weapons, chemical weapons, and I would also include nuclear weapon industry. There is a parole to have sustainable investments, preferring clean energy, clean oceans, and lesser carbon footprints. And it's also a duty to avoid companies who contribute to gross human rights violations like slavery, trafficking, and child labor. And of course, companies may be excluded because of corruption and a general term of a breach of basic ethical norms. Okay, so you have dual purposes. Secure profits for the Norwegian population, but make sure that you behave in an ethical manner. And one can argue, is there a conflict or is there not a conflict between the two purposes? Because there's one line of argument that ethical investments are more sustainable, are more profitable in the long term, and actually present markets seem to a certain manner support that point of view. But if you split up all these ethical standards, you can't really always defend them by the profit argument. And then it raises the question, well, what's going on here? Are we, in fact, have politicians instructed the oil fund to do international policing on standards in companies because it's the active ownership doctrine, by introducing best standards according to Norwegian standards, by influencing political regimes, by favoring them or not favoring them in investments. And this background, I think, is vital to understand the Nicolai Tangen debate, because now I will move on to Nicolai Tangen.
I just said in got 2.5 minutes to do that.
Ooh.
So then you need to talk quickly.
Because first of all, Norway was in shock when Nicolai Tangen was appointed, because nobody knew him, and wealth is certainly not an asset in Norway. We are suspicious of wealth, except our own. And when there were two sides, there was one side being strongly in support of him and accentuating how well qualified he was and what a fantastic track record he has as an investor. The other side, who was skeptical, he said he had no track record as in understanding ethical investments, and eco capitals even have used tax havens. Now, tax havens is not really part of the ethical program of the oil fund. So all the criticism against Tangen was really of a political nature, that you do not meet the standards of Norwegian political expectations and how to act on behalf of Norway in the ethical purpose of the oil fund, and ignored his qualifications as an investor, and I would really also say vice versa. So I believe what happened was that the whole debate followed those two lines. Now, very quickly, will Tangen survive? Maybe. I think certainly he has demonstrated a very strong will by a very expensive ticket to want to stay in this job and succeed in this job. And he has understood rather fast some sides of the Norwegian society when he expressed that when the Minister of Finance conveys a message, you do listen. If he continues to do that, he has a chance of surviving in spite of the skepticism and lack of trust against him. But what I can guarantee is that for politicians, this story has been a great success. They have demonstrated an enormous influence over a process where they really had hands off, and it's been successful, and they will continue to act within that space and will certainly watch Nicolai Tangen very carefully.
Also, thank you very much. Also, you told me before this that Tangen now has a trust deficit and will have a reduced maneuverability. Yes?
Yes,
Am I correct?
the level of tolerance for mistakes is not very high because there is a lack of trust among politicians and also in the general public. But they will haunt him on the ethical standards. They know he's very competent on the financial standards.
Well, we're going to hear with two people who's going to answer if he will be haunted or not. Maybe we can take you back up again. And could we have, who gave away this? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So now it's open for questions for everybody. I can start off if nobody has any questions. So, Fridtjof, will you haunt Tangen now? And especially on ethics?
Well, I think we will watch it with very closely, of course. Which I mean, like both political and also like journalistic oversight over this wealth fund is very, very important. So we will continue to watch very closely. I think every news organization in Norway is hunting for the first big interview now when he's sort of got the job, including us. I hope we will get it. But also I think Berit Reiss-Andersen's analysis was very good and very precise and very interesting with the sort of historical background, because you need to understand that to understand what happened now, that the oil money is like the people's money and they are political. Exactly. But also the political memory, as I think a leader of a think tank here said, is blessedly short in Norway. So when something's over, it's over, and people are, oh, okay, we forget, and then we move on, and the next big story is a politician who is disqualified because he has Me Too stories, or I mean, it moves on, and actually it's true, the political memory is very short. You can see sometimes that you think, how is this going to end? Everything is going to never be normal again. It goes back to normal pretty quick. And I think that, but I say, Tangen has to be very precise now for a year in what he says and how he behaves. But then I think maybe we might get back to normal. And of course, getting inside the fund and getting to know the organization and the people, there's a lot of knowledge there about how to act in Norwegian political society in that fund. They're very skilled at it. And a lot of these people are still there, including the sort of second in command in the fund, who also applied for the job but didn't get it on behalf of Tangen. But up to now, at least, he stays there and can probably teach him a lot. And so you can call Slyngstad and ask for more advice if he wants that too, I guess.
Everybody's hunting Tangen to get the first interview. Maybe he will shy away from Norwegian media and give it to Financial Times.
That's what we're hoping to.
So...
Lunch with Financial Times.
Yeah. That would be politically unsmart, I can say.
What will be
financially very clever.
That's his argument. You can say it differently. It will be very smart to go abroad.
Joint interviews.
Yeah.
I mean,
what will be the first question you ask him then, if you got him in front of you right now?
Prepared me for that. I don't know. Off the top of my head, how badly is the reputation of the fund being damaged? And were you afraid it would be so damaged that you thought about resigning or not taking the job? And I think I think it was.
And
That
when
was
will
the case.
and when will you have that beer? You need to ask him that.
Well, I think
Okay.
that's Vegard that wants that. So.
We have questions. We'll start with the ambassador, of course.
Hi, Richard Wood, Storbritannia's ambassador. Thank you so much to BNCC, our friends, for putting on the event, and to the speakers and to DLA for hosting. Really, really interesting, this question of governance, and it's worth remembering, because I don't think anybody mentioned it explicitly, that none of the money is invested in Norway.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting issue, the governance of the bank, for other countries too. The figure, I think, Richard, you mentioned 1.5% of all the world's shares averaged out. It's a lot higher than that in the UK. It's 2 or 3 times higher than that in the UK. And 8-point-something% of the fund is invested in the UK. So there's almost a question of potentially exporting Norway's values and policies as set by Parliament to the business sectors of other countries. Happily, our commitment to green energy and many of the priorities of the bank are the same, so that doesn't cause a problem, but it does show how important that question of governance is. And I've found it very difficult. They talk about a Chinese wall or a firewall between the Norges Bank and the fund, but that clearly, as we've seen, doesn't go all the way up to the ceiling. There are people who straddle over the top of that firewall, and where exactly are the investment decisions made and taken? Parliament sets a very broad mandate. The board of the central bank is supposed to have oversight. But where is that debate around what exactly the investment decisions are being taken? So, not much of a question there, but a broad comment about how important it is to other countries as well, how the fund is governed. Thanks again.
Okay. Who decides where to invest?
I think it's a good question because it is a very unusual answer in the sense that normally for an investor, the big decision is, how much you're investing in equities, how much you're in bonds. The oil fund doesn't take those decisions. They're taken by Parliament on the advice of the Finance Ministry. So it's a political mandate. So, my editors will ask me, do they think we should be going overweight on equities? I say, that's 10 bureaucrats in the Finance Ministry making that decision.
I
in a
don't
sense.
entirely agree
No,
with you,
no.
because what I wanted to show with my analysis is that there's several institutions instructing the fund. So up to that point, I agree with you. But they give general instructions. The particular investment decisions are made in the fund.
But
There should be no doubt about that.
But,
But
the thing
within
is
the
their
framework,
the mandate is so precise compared with a
Absolutely.
a typical fund. And just another,
but
to
it
your
makes
first,
more profit than a typical fund, doesn't it? So
it's small, but it's well run. It's incredible. But just to your first point, I think that inside the fund, that has been the big worry for a long time, is that they're perceived internationally as imposing Norwegian standards. And one really interesting thing, they put out a lot of papers on their positions. They prepared a paper on gender equality, and they haven't published it. And there are conflicting accounts as to why they haven't published it. But it was clear that at least somewhere in the system, it was seen that this would be too much of a Norwegian view.
This is very interesting from the ambassador also, because the fund, it grows so much. Just just the money that comes in from the oil business. There's so many billions each year that the fund sort of continues to grow, and you can sort of reach a critical mass in, for instance, the stock market, where the positions and ownership will be too big to handle politically. We will be a too big owner in British, for instance, or in the U.S. Business sector. And to a certain, if you come to it isn't invisible, but there is a threshold where we'll say, well, Norway is a massive owner, and therefore the Norwegian national interest and stuff will be applied to the decisions from the markets that we are in, whether we want it or not. And the sovereign wealth fund has been very sort of keen on saying we should keep it to sort of under that threshold. One thing is like when you had this big oil accident in the Gulf of Mexico where British Petroleum. And you said, what are we going to do? Are we going to fire the CEO, for instance? You know, and the U.S. just went ballistic towards BP and to Britain, of course, and Norway, through the fund, was the 4th biggest owner. And you're called by the board and saying, what do you suggest we're going to do to the sort of investment bureaucrats in Norges Bank? And they say, we don't want to touch this. We have no position on what to do, you know, in the British-US relations here. We just stay out of it. But if you come to that, and then I think Mr. Slyngstad tried some years ago to open up for new investment classes. Like real estate is one of them. They have like a 5% in real estate, and some very prestigious addresses in Paris, London, New York, and other places. But how much real estate can we have? And then they opened, at least tried to get, so we should also maybe invest in infrastructure, railways, maybe a new airport somewhere, not in Berlin, but some other place, you know, and because that would give a sound sort of profit for us. But politically, that was sort of taken out because it was too much of a political risk. But that debate with Tangen, given that he's in the job for 10 years, he maybe has to find some new investment classes or brand new countries or brand new markets so we can sort of diversify the fund away from political risk, I think. And that will be one of the things he had to put his mind to, how to do that.
Okay, I'm going to need shorter, crisper answers because it was a big line here now. We'll go with Veritas first.
Thank you, Thomas Eriksen, Norske Veritas. Question coming back a bit to the process, and one of the players in the process, I mean, and it was mentioned partly by you, and I think it was also in the last presentation when we saw the organization chart here, and particularly it's the role of the oversight committee. And what perceived by me, it seems that the leader of the oversight committee was kind of arguing her case through you guys. And even making statements that certain laws and regulations were broken. At least that's what came out in the news and the newspapers. So I mean that's a little bit of the backdrop. I think that when looking at the various roles of the governing board and the other boards and the oversight committee, I suppose that is the one that was on the far left. I mean, are there any reflections of the role of the oversight committee and something kind of that someone within this fair is now reflecting on whether kind of when the oversight committee has an issue, how do they kind of translate that? How do they communicate? Is it going back to the board, or do they have to go to the finance or treasury department, or do they have to use the media in order to kind of come forward with the case? That is for me very, it was very peculiar element of the whole process.
It's a very big question.
I'll try to answer it very short, because the oversight committee controls the bank, not the fund. And so it's sort of an indirect influence what happened. And it's a very good question, but it's absolutely unprecedented, the behavior of the oversight committee. So I think it will have some political consequences.
I would also say in short that the Oversight Committee is politically appointed by ex-politicians, a lot of parliament ex-MPs, and they injected the political logic into this process, although they tried very hard to stick to sort of a formal language and the formal thing. They, of course, injected the political logic into the thing. And was that bad or good? I mean, based on Berit's analysis, maybe this process needed political logic, and the Oversight Committee was the body that was able to do it and into this process.
Simon.
Yeah, it's more of an observation, really. The fund, when it was set, and it goes back to I guess what's interesting about this whole discussion is it's moved away from Tangen and more to how the investment fund is set up, and what we've seen is the political influence that goes with that. And I'd like to go back to when, Barry, you said it was founded. When it was founded politically, Norway was had a very different political landscape. There were two main parties. Very few smaller parties had any significant influence. Going forward, the political landscape is changing dramatically with more and more and more fragmentation and more coalitions with 4 or 5% of the potential vote. And we've already seen in the last 4 years, or the last 8 years, how minority parties have had significant influence within the constructs of government. Going forward, therefore, if I was an international business and I wanted to get significant influence, I would start talking to the NGOs, the influencing factors, based on what I've learned today, of the smaller political parties to gain political capital to change ultimately the way that this investment fund is going to work. And that's quite frightening because that's not transparent at all. That's just an observation that I just got from today. And I don't know how that's going to change out, but as politically as it becomes more fragmented, I think this is going to be more and more of an issue whether Tangen succeeds or fails.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
That's a good point.
what you were saying about exclusions, I think if you're in the fund, they accept the product exclusions, tobacco, nuclear weapons, as what the Norwegian people don't want to be invested, but they want as few of them as possible, basically. And so, I mean, you know, the coal came from Parliament, and then there were some oil and gas companies. I mean, it was an extraordinary story around that. Was excluded, and that was as a sop, basically, to Venstre, to the Liberals.
Yeah, but
So.
if you go the other way, I mean, if you get a populist party...
You can have that discussion afterwards. All right, property.
Yes, I was wondering what kind of changes can we expect to see with Mr. Tangen as the CEO?
Hard to say. For now on, it seems he spends his time inside the organization, getting to know the organization and the people. He has described himself as he does a lot of management by walking around. I guess he will do that. Smart. I mean, organizations like that may also probably his capital management fund is based on, you know, very competent people. You need to get to know them. You need to get them to know you and like you, and, you know, to get them to work. As long as the mandate is the same from the finance department and stuff, I guess the fund will look a lot like it does today. Will we have a new debate of whether it's going to be independent, maybe move out of Norges Bank and sort of answer to a board, a politically appointed board or something, or straight to the finance ministry? I don't foresee that, since we had that process so short time ago. We're not going to start that again. But when you look at Mr. Tangen and his plan for this big art museum, maybe he has a dream of getting this building, you know, and that will be his legacy, this beautiful building where the oil fund is managed from in Bjørvika or someplace. But I think that's a hard sell too, at least in the first 5-year period. So business as usual, that would be my guess.
I mean, I think he wants to really fine-tune a lot of things that are probably much less visible. I mean, I think if you look at how he ran AKO, it was very much about motivating his workers. I think actually inside the fund is seen as really positive. You know, you've had the same CEO for 12 years. Tangen is undoubtedly much more social than Slyngstad, you know, much more a people kind of person. And I think that's actually why he was hired. I mean, I don't think it was that they think he's going to run some kind of hedge fund strategy on the investments. You know, he's going to try and get that extra 0.01% relative return, or, you know, and then if you sweat that out, I mean, that's a lot of money for Norway.
Final 2 questions.
Clark first and then...
Yeah, my question is not about Tangen, because his ability to handle investment seems undebatable. But in a lot of people's opinion, the real clown in this circus is Mr. Øystein Olsen. How is he going to rebuild his reputation and maybe the reputation of Norges Bank?
Anybody cares to comment?
Feel free. How is he going to do that?
I do not know.
I think he's under...
job?
No.
I think he's under the most pressure. I mean, his communication skills were severely lacking, I think. I can, as a reporter, I can state that. But, you know, he's a protected position. I mean, it's still a sensitive time for the Norwegian economy with coronavirus and so forth. So I think his position is safe, and therefore you can ride this kind of thing out. Probably.
I think he has about 1 year left of his tenure. So I mean, but also it was said in the sort of political back channels that we were trying to listen in on that. In this day, with all the sort of, and before the summer even worse, you know, with so much economic unrest, are you really going to change the head of the central bank? Because when you look at the central bank part of this, he has delivered fantastically for the government. We have a weak krona, which is good for export and very good for the oil fund. We have a low interest rate, I mean, which keeps you popular among the population, and our economy is sort of going well, and there's no unrest, and we went through, you know, the oil drop, everything. So like the sort of monetary policy and everything, he delivered, you know. I mean, probably like, you know, he's a skilled macroeconomist, but also for a government, this is like, it's like a dream head of the central bank. There is. Everything is calm, and it's, you know, it's the thing you want: low interest rate and a low currency rate. So then is no appetite to sort of put him out for this, you know, which is kind of on the side of his main mission. And until this, I think he was pretty well respected. It was kind of shocking that he handled this communication around this so bad, because up to that, he was, you know, smooth sailing and a nice guy and quite a good talker when he held speeches and stuff. So. But
So
1 year, he will sit that out, I think.
some behind-the-scene information there, he was actually saved by Corona.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, DLA Piper, final question, and then a few words from you, Simon, again.
Thank you. Kjetil Hansen, I'm from DLA Piper as well. I head up our regulatory department. One perspective of this, I mean, the whole matter demonstrated how things were sort of legal, independent, and politics with politics, and then it all became mixed. One thing that we face when we're advising clients that want to invest in Norway that has, you know, no past experience, no track record, they perceive Norway as, you know, rule of law, we respect laws, independent courts, everything is fine. They have one question. What about political interference in our business? What is the predictability of Norway? Where should I put my money? Should I invest in Norway? How does law interplay with politics? When can I expect political intervention? Would you think that this matter would sort of hurt or damage Norway's sort of reputation as a risk-free investment country, no risk of political interference, or has it enhanced such risk? I think that's for Richard. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's a bit what Fridtjof said about sort of blessedly short memories. I mean, I think these things, you know, when you're in it, you think, you know, it's the damage the reputation of Norges Bank, of the fund, of Norway, you know, whatever. 3-6 months time, I think it all calms down. And no, I mean, I think actually probably, you know, the pipeline dispute it would be much more damaging in that regard. You know, I think this will play potentially in the future on the fund itself, but I don't see it spilling over generally into business.
It's a drama about state money within the state, I mean, actually.
Yeah. Who
The
owns
sovereign wealth
the
fund
account?
it's a state fund, you know.
Yeah.
And they don't compete with everybody. They only have to answer to one thing, and that is the state and the population. They're not in competition about other people's money either. They only have one customer, and that's the Norwegian population, you know.
So we're running a bit over time now, and I'm going to stop this discussion and leave the few final words to our chairman, Simon.
You probably need to do that for the people listening on.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you all for coming. Hope you found it interesting. It's my first event together with Håkon and the new board. It marks a very big difference in the way that we perhaps done things in the past. And I'd like to just basically thank all three speakers. They've been excellent, informative, and thoroughly entertaining and interesting. And we'll have some wine for you shortly. The next events that we have actually will be, we have in case you're not aware, we've joined the British Chambers of Commerce, which is a global organisation of 93,000 businesses. This is being streamed through the BCC network as we speak. So I know there are people, for example, from DNB in Chile watching this right at this precise moment in time. I'd like to draw your attention to just a couple of events that I know are coming up, and you will find that information on our website. The first is on the 22nd of September. That is with Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, which I think is quite opportune. And he will be in discussions with the head of the BCC. I just have to check, just because I've got the heads up that came through that on the 27th of October, the BCC will also have another broadcast. This is with Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So if you're interested in his perspectives on what's going on, then I suggest you go to our website and you will be able to register for that event. For us, our next event, I believe, is the 15th of October, and there we have the CEO of Schibsted, who is going to be giving us an overview of their subsidiary or their major investor who took over the largest chunk of eBay, how they did it from the position they came from. Together with the head of politics, I believe it is, from NHO, who is going to give us an insight into what really went on in the collective bargaining discussions between the unions and industry. So I'd really appreciate to see some of the many faces in the same that are here today at that next event. We will always keep it COVID compliant. And I'll say thank you very much once again, and look forward to seeing you all again very soon.
Thank you, and I hope you stick around a bit, because I know there are people here who want to talk to you guys. So, yeah.